He's going to kill me. The door is splintering. She texted the wrong man. On my way, don't scream. Mafia boss replied, 1% battery, 1 chance to live. She sent the text in the dark. She thought it was her brother. It wasn't. The man who saw that message at 2:14 a.m. in a soundproofed high-rise wasn't a family member. He didn't call the police. Adrian, scarred muscle and cold authority, stood up from his mahogany desk, buttoned a black tailored suit over his tattooed chest, and looked at the photo of the bruised, hazel-eyed girl on his screen. He didn't blink. He just grabbed his jacket and said one thing to the shadows. Get the car. We're going hunting. Sofia Marino was running out of oxygen and time. Hidden in a freezing bathroom, she sent a desperate plea to the only number she remembered by heart. But one shaking finger hit a 7 instead of a 1. She just handed her life to the most dangerous man in the city. Subscribe now, because you won't believe what happens when the devil decided to become a guardian. The silence inside the apartment was broken only by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a shoulder hitting the bathroom door. Each impact sent a fresh wave of dust from the ceiling and a new spike of terror through Sofia Marino's chest. She sat on the edge of the tub, clutching her side. Her olive skin was pale, a stark contrast to the blossoming purple bruise across her cheekbone. She tasted salt and copper. Open the door, Sofia. His voice came through the wood, low, calm, and terrifyingly reasonable. You know I hate it when you hide. It only makes the ending worse. Sofia didn't breathe. She couldn't. Her ribs felt like jagged glass with every inhale. She knew this was the night. He wasn't just going to hurt her this time, he was going to finish it. Her fingers, slick with blood from a split lip, fumbled for her phone on the tile floor. The screen was a spiderweb of cracks, the backlight flickering weakly. 1% battery. The red icon blinked like a dying heart. She didn't have time to check the contact. She didn't have time to think. She typed with a thumb that wouldn't stop shaking. He's going to kill me. Bathroom. Locked. Please help. Apartment 9C. She hit send. Her eyes drifted to the top of the screen as the message delivered. The number wasn't her brother's. It started with a prefix she didn't recognize. Across the city, in a room filled with men who killed for sport, a phone vibrated on a glass table. Adrian Kozlov picked it up. He saw the grainy photo of the delicate, terrified girl. He saw the bruises that marred her soft features. The air in the room turned to ice. Adrian's gray eyes, usually emotionless, flared with a sudden predatory heat. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask how she got his private line. He simply typed back, on my way, don't make a sound. Back in the apartment, the bathroom door frame groaned and finally gave way. The wood splintered. Sofia looked up, dropping her dead phone. But as her abuser stepped into the room, he didn't realize that a much bigger monster was already screaming through the city streets to claim what was now his. Subscribe to this channel as we continue with this story. The ceramic tiles were ice cold against Sofia's bare thighs, but she hardly felt it. The only sensation that registered was the rhythmic, sickening crunch of wood splintering just inches from her head. Each blow against the bathroom door vibrated through her spine, a countdown she couldn't stop. Sofia, don't make me do this. Greg's voice drifted through the cracks, eerily calm. It was the tone he used when he was trying to convince her that the bruise on her ribs was her own fault. You're making a scene. Just open the door and we can talk about this like adults. She squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the dead phone to her chest as if it were a talisman. The red 1% warning had flickered and vanished seconds ago, leaving her in a darkness broken only by the thin sliver of hallway light peeking through the bottom of the door. She had sent the text. She had seen the word delivered. But the reply, on my way, felt like a hallucination born of sheer terror. Who was he? The man behind the unknown number didn't sound like her brother. He sounded like a promise of something far more lethal. A heavy thud shook the entire frame. A jagged shard of white-painted wood flew across the small room, skidding into the bathtub. Sofia scrambled backward, her heels slipping on the bath mat, until her back hit the far wall. She was trapped between the toilet and the vanity, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that made her side scream in protest. I know you're in there, Sofia. I can hear you breathing. The door groaned, a long, agonizing sound of metal screws yielding to brute force. Greg wasn't a large man, but his rage gave him a frantic, terrifying strength. Another kick landed near the handle and the wood finally gave way. The door swung inward, hanging precariously by a single twisted hinge. Greg stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his eyes blown wide with a manic sort of clarity. He looked at the wreckage he'd created, then shifted his gaze to Sofia. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked disappointed, which was always worse. "Look at this mess," he whispered, stepping over the debris. "Look what you made me do to our home." Sofia tried to speak, to beg, but her throat was a desert. She could only watch as he reached out, his hand wrapping firmly around her upper arm. His grip was a familiar brand of pain, bruising the skin instantly. He hauled her upward, forcing her to stand despite the way her vision blurred from the movement. "Please," she finally managed, the word barely a rasp. "Greg, please, it'll be better. I'll fix it. It's too late for that, Sofia. You tried to leave. I saw you packing that bag under the bed." He leaned in close, the scent of stale beer and adrenaline filling her senses. He pressed her back against the tiled wall, his forearm resting heavily against her throat. "Where did you think you were going? Who did you think was coming to save you?" He raised his other hand, drawing it back. Sofia flinched, her eyes snapping shut, bracing for the impact she knew was coming. She waited for the familiar sting, the ringing in her ears, the darkness. Instead, she heard something else. It wasn't a scream or a plea. It was the sound of the apartment's heavy front door being pulverized. It didn't just open, it exploded. The crash was so violent it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Greg froze, his hand still hovering in the air. He turned his head toward the hallway, his brow furrowed in confusion. What the hell was? He never finished the sentence. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed against the hardwood of the living room. They weren't the hurried steps of a neighbor or the frantic run of a policeman. They were slow, weighted. The sound of a man who owned the ground he walked on. The temperature in the small, humid bathroom seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and imposing, swallowing Greg's smaller frame. Sofia opened her eyes. Standing in the ruined doorway was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and shadows. He was massive, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame. He wore a black suit that looked expensive enough to buy the entire building, the top buttons of his white shirt undone to reveal the dark ink of tattoos creeping up his throat. His face was a mask of cold, clinical detachment. His eyes, a piercing, emotionless gray, didn't look at the broken door or the mess on the floor. They locked onto Sofia's bruised face. Greg let go of her arm, his bravado vanishing as he stumbled back a step. Who are you? This is private property. I'll call the cops." The stranger didn't answer. He didn't even look at Greg. He stepped into the bathroom, his presence so dominant that the room felt like it was shrinking. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, closing the distance until he was standing directly in front of them. "You're the one who sent the text," the man said. His voice was a deep, low rumble that vibrated in Sofia's very bones. It wasn't a question. Sofia couldn't move. She couldn't even nod. She just stared up at him, her heart hammering against her injured ribs. Up close, he was even more intimidating. The air around him smelled of expensive cologne and something metallic, something dangerous. Greg reached out, trying to push the intruder's shoulder. "I said get out. You can't just walk in here." The stranger's hand moved faster than Sofia could follow. In one fluid motion, he caught Greg's wrist. There was a sickening, wet snap, and Greg let out a high-pitched wail, dropping to his knees as his arm was twisted at an impossible angle. The big man finally looked down at Greg, his expression not changing in the slightest. It was the look of a man stepping on an insect, not out of anger, but simply because it was in the way. "You made a mistake," the man said softly, his voice colder than the winter wind outside. "You touched something that belongs to me." He looked back at Sofia, and for a fleeting second the ice in his eyes seemed to crack. He reached out with his free hand, his large, calloused thumb grazing the bruise on her cheek with a gentleness that felt entirely alien. "I told you to wait," he murmured. Sofia felt a tear finally break free, rolling down her face and over his thumb. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why he had come. But as she looked into those gray eyes, she realized the man who had been breaking her door down was a shadow. The man standing in front of her was the Storm. "Are you the one from the phone?" she whispered. The man didn't smile, but he stepped closer, shielding her body from the sight of Greg groveling on the floor. He leaned down, his lips brushing near her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "My name is Adrian," he said. "And from this moment on, no one touches you unless I say so." He reached down and easily swept her into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. Sofia's head fell naturally against his shoulder, her fingers curling into the fine wool of his suit jacket. She was terrified, yes, but for the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight in her chest began to lift. As Adrian carried her out of the ruined apartment, past the man who had tried to break her, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had what he came for. The leather of the backseat was cool against Adrian's hand, but the phone in his palm felt like it was burning. He didn't usually look at messages from unknown numbers. In his world, an unsaved contact was either a solicitation, a threat, or a mistake, and he had people to handle all three. But something about the notification chime at 2:14 a.m. had cut through the heavy silence of the boardroom. He had been sitting across from 3 men who were terrified of him, negotiating a shipping contract that would solidify his hold on the eastern docks. He was bored. He was weary of the stuttering excuses of men who lacked his discipline. Then his personal device, the one only 4 people had the number to, vibrated on the mahogany surface. The image had loaded slowly. First, a flash of pale olive skin. Then the eyes. Hazel, wide, and swimming in a terror so pure it felt like a physical blow to his chest. Below the eye, a dark, angry blooming of purple and red. It was a face that didn't belong in his world of calculated violence. It was a face that belonged to a life he had long ago forgotten how to live. "He's going to kill me." Bathroom. Locked. "Please help." Apartment 9ch. He should have deleted it. He should have tossed the phone to his associate Victor and told him to trace the leak. But he didn't. He looked at the girl's eyes again. He saw a reflection of a memory he had buried 20 years deep, a woman's voice screaming behind a locked door while a young Adrian huddled in a hallway, unable to break the wood. He had stood up without a word, the heavy chair scraping against the floor like a gunshot. The businessmen had flinched, thinking the execution was starting. Adrian didn't even look at them. He was already typing, "On my way." Now sitting in the back of the SUV as it tore through the city, Adrian watched the blur of streetlights against the glass. His heart wasn't racing. It didn't do that anymore. But there was a pressure in his chest, a low, steady hum of adrenaline. He was a man of logic and cold steel, yet here he was, risking a high-level summit for a stranger who had dialed a 7 instead of a 1. 30 seconds out, boss, Victor said from the driver's seat. He didn't ask questions. He had seen the look on Adrian's face when he left the boardroom, and he knew better than to speak. Adrian checked the slide of his Glock, the metallic click satisfying in the quiet cabin. He didn't plan on using it. A man who beat women didn't deserve a bullet. He deserved the weight of a hand that knew how to break things properly. As the car pulled up to the curb of a crumbling brick apartment complex, Adrian was already out the door before it fully stopped. He didn't run. He walked with the heavy, inevitable pace of a landslide. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his boots silent on the stained carpet. When he reached the 4th floor, he didn't need the apartment number. He could hear the thudding. He could hear the muffled, pathetic voice of a man trying to sound powerful by breaking something smaller than himself. Adrian felt the familiar coldness settle over him. It was a professional coat of armor, the hitman's heart, that kept him detached from the blood he spilled. But as he reached the door of 9C and heard a soft, broken whimper from inside, the armor cracked. This wasn't business. This was a debt he owed to a hallway 20 years ago. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He put his shoulder into the door with the full force of a man who spent his mornings in a boxing gym and his afternoons at a shooting range. The frame snapped like dry kindling. The apartment smelled of cheap beer and unwashed laundry. It was a tomb of a home. Adrian's eyes scanned the room, landing instantly on the bathroom door. It was hanging by a thread. He stepped over a fallen lamp, his gaze fixed on the man standing over the girl. The man was small, not in stature but in spirit. He had the twitchy, desperate energy of a coward who had finally found someone he could dominate. When Adrian stepped into the light, the coward's face went from smug to ghostly white. Adrian felt a flicker of disgust. This was what people feared. This was the monster in the girl's life. He felt a sudden, sharp need to erase this man from the map, to prove to the girl on the floor that the world held much bigger shadows than this. He saw her then. Sofia. She was tucked into a corner, her small hands clutching a dead phone. She looked like a bird with a broken wing, waiting for the final blow. Her hazel eyes met his, and for the first time in his adult life, Adrian felt the urge to lower his guard. He watched the coward drop to his knees. He watched the wrist snap under his grip. It felt good. It felt like justice, a concept he usually found laughable. When he finally touched her cheek, his hand felt too big, too rough for her skin. He saw a tear fall over his thumb, and he felt a strange, jarring shift in his internal compass. He had come here to stop a murder, but as he looked at her, he realized he wasn't going to just leave her here. He didn't care about the docks anymore. He didn't care about the meeting he had abandoned. He looked at Sofia Marino and saw the only thing in this gray, rotting city that was worth keeping clean. "My name is Adrian," he told her, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. It was softer than he'd ever spoken to anyone. He picked her up, her weight almost nothing against his chest. She was shivering, her fingers digging into his suit jacket. He felt a sudden, fierce sense of possession. She had reached out into the dark, and she had caught him. Now the dark was going to make sure she never had to reach again. As he walked out, he caught his reflection in a hallway mirror. He looked like the monster everyone said he was, scarred, tattooed, and carrying a broken woman. But for the first time, the hitman's heart wasn't cold. It was beating for a reason. He didn't look at the man on the floor as he left. He didn't need to. He had already decided that Greg wouldn't see the sunrise. "Drive," he told Victor as they reached the SUV. "Where to, boss?" Back to the meeting, Adrian looked down at the girl in his lap, her head resting against his heart. She had fallen into a shallow, exhausted sleep, her breathing finally evening out. "No," Adrian said, his voice like iron. "Home. And call the doctor. If there's a single mark on her tomorrow, I am burning this city down." The digital clock on the dashboard of the Cadillac Escalade flickered with a cold blue light. 2:19 a.m. Adrian stared at it, his jaw set so tight the muscle pulsed beneath his stubble. Outside, the city of Philadelphia was a blurred streak of gray concrete and yellow sodium lamps. Victor had the speedometer pushing 80, weaving through the narrow, rain-slicked streets of the Italian market district with a silent, surgical focus. "Minutes, boss," Victor said, his voice steady despite the way he took a corner on shrieking tires. Adrian didn't respond. He was looking at the last message Sofia had sent. "He's going to kill me." He had seen death in every form, fast, slow, deserved, and accidental, but the desperation in those 5 words felt like a physical weight pressing against his ribs. He felt a rare, serrated edge of panic that he shouldn't have felt for a stranger. He kept imagining the light fading from those hazel eyes before he could reach her. In the apartment on the 4th floor, Sofia was counting the seconds by the throb of her heartbeat. Each time Greg's shoulder slammed into the bathroom door, a new layer of white paint flaked off like snow, falling onto her bruised knees. She had pulled her legs up to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible, as if she could simply disappear into the porcelain of the tub. "Sofia, I'm losing my patience," Greg shouted from the other side. The reasonable tone was gone now, replaced by a jagged, high-pitched rage. "You think someone is coming, at this hour, in this neighborhood?" "Nobody cares about you, Sofia, only me," Wood groaned. A long vertical crack appeared near the top hinge. Sofia stared at it, her breath coming in shallow, panicked whimpers. Her phone was a cold, dead weight in her hand. 11:43, 11:44. The time felt like it was stretching, pulling her thin until she was ready to snap. She looked at the small, frosted window above the shower, too high and too narrow to climb through. There was no way out. 1 minute, Victor announced. The SUV drifted around a sharp turn, the tires grabbing for purchase on the wet asphalt. Adrian reached into the side pocket of the door and pulled out a pair of black leather gloves. He pulled them on slowly, smoothing the material over his knuckles. The ritual calmed the storm in his chest, replacing it with a cold, predatory clarity. He thought about the apartment. He knew the building. It was a sagging pre-war walk-up with a broken buzzer and a hallway that smelled of damp rot. It was the kind of place where screams were often ignored. He felt a surge of loathing for the man inside, the kind of man who chose a victim based on their silence. On the fourth floor, the door finally gave way. The top hinge screamed as it was ripped from the frame. Greg didn't even use his shoulder this time. He simply kicked the center of the door and the wood buckled inward. He stepped into the small, humid space, his face flushed and glistening with sweat. He looked at Sofia, huddled in the corner, and a slow, distorted smile spread across his lips. "There you are," he whispered. He reached out and grabbed her by the hair. Sofia shrieked, a raw, primal sound that tore at her throat. He dragged her out of the bathroom and into the hallway, her heels dragging uselessly over the debris of the broken door. The pain in her side was a white-hot flare, making her vision swim. She clawed at his wrists, her nails leaving red furrows in his skin, but he didn't seem to feel it. "Going to learn, Sofia," he said, throwing her down onto the hardwood of the living room. "You're going to learn that you don't turn your back on me." He loomed over her, reaching for the heavy glass ashtray on the coffee table. Sofia scrambled backward on her elbows, her breath hitching in her chest. She looked toward the front door, praying for a miracle she didn't believe in. 3 minutes. The man on the phone had said 3 minutes, but the hallway was silent. The apartment was a tomb. Greg raised the heavy glass, his eyes dark with a final, lethal intent. Sofia closed her eyes and tucked her chin, waiting for the world to go black. Then the building shook. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't the sound of a key. It was the thunderous, metallic crash of the apartment's front door being forced off its mounting. The sound was so loud it felt like a physical shockwave. Greg spun around, the ashtray slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. Adrian Kozlov stepped through the dust. He didn't look like a man. He looked like an inevitable force of nature. The hallway light caught the sharp line of his jaw and the cold, gray steel of his eyes. He stood in the wreckage of the entryway, his hands hanging relaxed at his sides, his presence filling the small room until there was no air left for anyone else. The transition from the street to the apartment had taken Adrian exactly 12 seconds. He had bypassed the elevator, his lungs burning as he took the stairs. His mind focused entirely on the sound of the struggle coming from 9C when he reached the door and heard the girl's scream. The last of his restraint vanished. He looked at Sofia. He saw the way she was trembling on the floor, the blood on her lip, the terror that had turned her hazel eyes into glass. Then he looked at Greg. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the crash. Adrian didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply walked forward, his boots crunching over the broken glass. He moved with a terrifying, rhythmic grace, his eyes never leaving Greg's face. Greg tried to find his voice, his chest heaving as he backed away toward the window. Who the hell are you? Get out, I have a gun." It was a lie and they both knew it. Adrian didn't stop. He stopped 3 feet in front of the man, his height casting a long, dark shadow that swallowed Greg whole. "The one," Adrian said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. Sofia watched from the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the man who had answered her text. He was more frightening than anyone she had ever seen, a giant of a man covered in tattoos and expensive wool. Yet as he stood between her and Greg, she felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of warmth. The 3 minutes were over. The savior had arrived, and he had brought the darkness of the entire city with him. Adrian turned his head slightly towards Sofia, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "Close your eyes, Sofia," he commanded softly. She did. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she heard the sound of the wind howling through the open doorway, and the sound of a coward finally realizing that his time had run out. Sofia followed Adrian's command, her eyelids snapping shut as the world around her descended into a terrifying, rhythmic cacophony. She heard the wet thud of a strike, a sharp gasp of air, and then the heavy, unceremonious sound of a body hitting the floor. She kept her eyes pressed tight, her breath coming in jagged hitches until a hand, large, warm, and steadier than anything she had ever known, rested gently on her shoulder. "Open your eyes, Sofia," Adrian said. His voice was like deep velvet, vibrating through the cold air of the apartment. When she obeyed, the first thing she saw was the contrast. It was a visual shock that made her heart stutter. Greg was curled on the floor, a pathetic heap of a man clutching his stomach and gasping for air. He looked small. He looked fragile. For 3 years, he had been the giant in her life, a towering figure of fear that dictated every second of her existence. But standing over him, Adrian Kozlov made him look like a broken toy. Adrian was an architectural marvel of a man. At 63, he seemed to physically push the walls of the cramped living room outward. His black tailored suit was immaculate, even after kicking in a deadbolt, and the white dress shirt beneath was open at the collar, revealing the intricate dark ink of tattoos that curled around his neck like a warning. He wasn't panting. He wasn't sweating. He stood with the relaxed, terrifying poise of a predator that had already finished the hunt. The light from the flickering hallway bulb caught the sharp, military-like fade of his hair and the slight roughness of his skin, a face that had seen battles Sofia couldn't imagine. His eyes were a piercing, emotionless blue, scanning the room for threats with the mechanical precision of a soldier. He looked like death in a $1,000 suit. Is he dead? Sofia whispered, her voice trembling. Adrian didn't look at Greg. He kept his gaze on her. No, not yet. He reached down, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. Sofia flinched instinctively, her muscles bracing for the pain she usually associated with a man's touch, but Adrian's grip was different. It was firm, supporting her weight with an ease that made her feel weightless. He lifted her from the floor, pulling her against the solid heat of his chest. The scent of him hit her then, expensive sandalwood leather and the faint, metallic tang of the rain outside. It was a masculine, grounding smell that seemed to act as an anchor for her drifting consciousness. "My phone," she murmured, her head lolling against his shoulder. It's dead." "Doesn't matter," Adrian said. "You won't need it where we're going." As he turned to carry her out, Greg managed to find his breath. He scrambled to his knees, his face twisted in a mixture of agony and desperate, misplaced bravado. "You can't just take her," Greg wheezed, blood leaking from a split lip. "She's mine. Who do you think you are? I'll call the precinct. My uncle is—" Adrian stopped. He didn't turn around fully. He simply slanted his head back, his profile looking like it was carved from cold marble. The sheer weight of his silence was enough to cut Greg's sentence short. "I'm the man who is giving you 10 seconds to start running," Adrian said. His tone devoid of any anger. It was the lack of emotion that made it truly chilling. "If I see your shadow in this zip code after tonight, I won't use my hands. I'll use the city to bury you." Greg looked at Adrian's tattoos, at the broadness of his shoulders, and at the black-clad men who were now appearing in the hallway behind him. Men who moved like shadows and looked at Greg as if he were nothing more than a piece of trash to be collected. The realization finally hit him. This wasn't a hero. This wasn't a policeman. This was a king. Greg didn't say another word. He scrambled toward the back bedroom, tripping over his own feet in his haste to get away from the man holding Sofia. Adrian didn't spare him another glance. He walked out of the apartment, his boots heavy and rhythmic on the hardwood. As they stepped into the hallway, Sofia looked up at him. From this angle, he looked like a statue of some ancient, vengeful god. She saw the light stubble on his jaw and the way his blue eyes remained fixed on the exit, never wavering. "Why?" she asked softly. Adrian looked down at her. For a split second, the coldness in his eyes flickered, replaced by something dark and intensely possessive. He didn't answer with words. He simply tightened his grip, pulling her closer until her ear was pressed against his heartbeat. It was slow and steady, the heart of a man who feared nothing. They reached the street, where a black SUV was idling, its headlights cutting through the misty Philadelphia rain. Victor held the door open, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Adrian slid into the backseat, never letting go of Sofia. He kept her in his lap, her head tucked under his chin, shielding her from the prying eyes of the street. The interior of the car was warm and smelled of rich leather. As the door closed, the sounds of the city were silenced by the heavy, reinforced glass. "Drive," Adrian commanded. "Penthouse, boss?" Victor asked. "No," Adrian said, his gaze fixed on the bruises on Sofia's arm. "The estate, and call the doctor. Tell him if there is a single permanent mark on her, I will find a way to make him feel her pain." Sofia felt the car move, a smooth, powerful surge of motion. She watched the apartment building disappear into the darkness, a place that had been her prison for 3 years. She looked at Adrian's hand resting on her knee. His skin was fair but rough, covered in the dark ink of a sleeve tattoo that looked like thorns and shadows. She was terrified of him. She knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the man holding her was capable of horrors Greg couldn't even dream of. And yet, as the warmth of the car seeped into her bones and the steady beat of Adrian's heart thrummed against her cheek, she felt the first spark of a safety she hadn't known since she was a child. She had texted a stranger for help, and the devil himself had answered. But as she drifted into a shallow, exhausted sleep, she realized that for the first time in her life, the devil was on her side. Adrian watched her as her breathing finally evened out. He didn't move, afraid to disturb the fragile peace of her sleep. He looked at her delicate, olive-toned skin, and the way her brunette hair was matted with sweat and dust. She was so small in his arms, so soft. He had spent his entire life building an empire of fear, surrounding himself with steel and stone. He had never wanted anything to protect. Protection was a weakness. It was a target. But as he looked at Sofia Marino, he felt a strange, new kind of power. It wasn't the power of the gun in his holster or the millions in his bank account. It was the power of being the only thing standing between this girl and the rest of the world. He leaned back against the leather seat, his eyes turning back to the cold, blue light of the city. The hunt was over, but the rain was just beginning. He had claimed her, and in the world of Adrian Kozlov, what was claimed was never, ever let go. The black SUV sat idling at the curb, its engine a low, predatory hum that vibrated through the floorboards. Inside the cabin, the air was silent and heavy with the scent of leather and the fatting adrenaline of the rescue. Adrian didn't move. He sat with Sofia gathered against his chest, her weight so slight it felt like holding a shadow. He could feel the erratic, bird-like flutter of her heart against his ribs, and it stoked a cold, quiet fire in his gut that he had no intention of putting out. He looked out the tinted window at the sagging silhouette of the apartment building. To the world, it was just another decaying block in a city full of them. To Sofia, it had been a torture chamber. He looked down at her at the way her long, brunette hair was matted against her pale forehead and the dark, angry bloom of the bruise on her cheek. "Victor," Adrian said, his voice a low shelf of ice. "Yes, boss, take her to the estate. The doctor is already waiting. Do not stop for anything." "If a leaf hits this car, I want to know why," Victor nodded, his eyes meeting Adrian's in the rearview mirror. He saw the shift in his employer, the transition from the man who protected to the man who erased. "And you, boss?" "I have a debt to settle," Adrian said. He shifted Sofia gently, transferring her into the plush leather of the seat. She stirred, a small, broken sound escaping her lips as her hand instinctively reached for the warmth of his suit jacket. Adrian paused, his large, tattooed hand hovering over her brow. He smoothed a stray lock of hair away from her eyes. "You're safe now, Sofia," he whispered. "The world you knew is gone. Sleep." He stepped out of the vehicle and closed the door with a soft, final thud. He watched the taillights of the SUV disappear into the misty rain before turning back toward the building. He didn't take the stairs this time. He took the freight elevator, the rusted metal cage groaning as it rose toward the 4th floor. When he stepped back into apartment 9C, the air was still thick with the smell of wood, dust, and fear. Greg was in the bedroom, frantically shoving clothes into a duffel bag. He was sobbing, a frantic, wet sound that made Adrian's lip curl in disgust. The coward hadn't even finished packing before Adrian's shadow fell across the doorway. Greg froze, a tangled mess of shirts falling from his trembling hands. He looked at Adrian, and the realization that he wasn't going to be allowed to just run hit him like a physical blow. "I was leaving," Greg shrieked, his voice cracking. "You said I had 10 seconds. I'm going. I'll never see her again, I swear." Adrian walked into the room. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying patience of a man who knew exactly how this ended. He reached out and grabbed the duffel bag, tossing it aside as if it weighed nothing. "Seconds was for the man you used to be," Adrian said, his voice devoid of heat. "But I've spent the last 5 minutes thinking about the marks on her ribs, and the math doesn't add up for a head start. Please." Greg fell to his knees, reaching out to grab the hem of Adrian's trousers. I loved her, I have a temper, I'm getting help. Don't do this. Adrian looked down at the hand touching his suit. In one swift motion, he drove his boot into Greg's chest, sending him sprawling back against the bed frame. Adrian didn't wait for him to recover. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted tablet. He tapped a few commands, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. Greg Miller, Adrian read aloud. Junior associate at a mid-tier firm. 2 prior noise complaints. A car lease 3 months in arrears. A digital footprint that says you're a productive member of society. Adrian looked up, his blue eyes as sharp as glass. As of 3 minutes ago, Greg Miller no longer exists. Your bank accounts are drained. Your social security number is flagged as deceased. Your credit is a graveyard. You have no money, no identity, and no place to go. Greg stared at him, his mouth agape. What, you? You can't do that. Can do much more than that, Adrian said. He stepped closer, leaning down until he was inches from Greg's face. I don't just kill people, Greg. I delete them. I take away the ground they stand on until they're just ghosts. You spent 3 years making her feel like she was nothing. Now you actually are. Adrian reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the floor. It was filled with cash, enough to get a man across the country, but not enough to start a life. Take the money, Adrian commanded. Use it to get as far from Philadelphia as the road goes. If you ever use your real name, if you ever try to contact a soul from your past, or if you ever, even in a dream, think about Sofia Marino, the men I have watching you will finish the job I'm starting now. Greg looked at the money, then back at the giant standing over him. He saw the tattoos on Adrian's neck, the expensive suit, and the absolute lack of mercy in his gaze. He realized then that death would have been simpler. Adrian was leaving him alive, but he was stripping him of his soul. Go, Adrian said. Greg didn't hesitate. He grabbed the money and ran, stumbling through the ruined living room and out into the night, leaving everything he owned behind. He was a ghost now, a man with no history and no future. Adrian stood in the center of the bedroom for a long moment. He looked at the framed photos on the nightstand, pictures of Sofia smiling, though the smiles never reached her eyes. He picked one up, staring at the delicate curve of her jaw before dropping it and crushing the glass under his heel. He walked through the apartment, methodically destroying anything that belonged to the man who had lived here. He didn't do it out of rage. He did it with the clinical efficiency of a cleaner. By the time he reached the front door, the apartment was a shell. He pulled out his phone and made a single call. It's done, Adrian said. Send the crew. I want the lease terminated, the furniture burned, and the records wiped. By dawn, I want this place to look like it's been vacant for a decade. Understood, boss, the voice on the other end replied. And the girl, she's at the estate, Adrian said, his tone softening just enough to be noticed. She stays there, permanently. He walked out of the building and back into the rain. He felt the tension in his shoulders finally begin to dissipate. He had deleted her past. He had burned the bridge that led back to her suffering. Now there was only the future, a future he would build for her, stone by stone, within the walls of his own world. As he climbed into the second car that had arrived to collect him, he leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. He thought about the way Sofia had gripped his jacket. She was a broken thing, but Adrian had spent his life fixing broken empires. He knew how to reinforce a foundation. He knew how to make something last. He wasn't a hero. He knew that. He was a man who used fear as a currency and violence as a language. But as the car moved toward the outskirts of the city, toward the high stone walls of his estate, Adrian realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be feared by everyone. He wanted to be the only person Sofia Marino ever felt safe with. The reckoning was over. The past was dead. And as the iron gates of his estate swung open to welcome him home, Adrian Kozlov knew that the real work, the work of winning the heart of the girl he had stolen from the dark, was only just beginning. The first thing Sofia noticed was the silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the apartment, the kind that felt like a predator holding its breath, but a deep, velvet stillness that seemed to hum with expensive clockwork. She didn't open her eyes immediately. She allowed her senses to catalog the bed beneath her. The sheets were silk and cool, with a thread count so high they felt like liquid against her skin. The mattress was soft enough to swallow her whole, a stark contrast to the lumpy, stained foam she had spent years trying to get comfortable on. When she finally blinked, the light was soft and amber, filtered through heavy floor-to-ceiling drapes that blocked out the morning sun. She wasn't in a room, she was in a cathedral of wealth. The ceiling was vaulted with intricate crown molding, and the air smelled faintly of vanilla and expensive wax. Memory rushed back in a cold, sharp wave. The splintering wood, the gray eyes, the sensation of being carried through the rain. Sofia sat up abruptly, a hiss of pain escaping her lips as her ribs protested the movement. She looked down at herself. Someone had changed her. She was wearing a white silk nightgown that felt like air, and her arm was neatly bandaged. The sight of the clean white gauze made her throat tighten. "You're awake." The voice came from the shadows near the window. Sofia flinched, pulling the duvet up to her chin as she searched the room. Adrian was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, his long legs crossed, a glass of dark liquid resting on the armrest. He had discarded his suit jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned halfway, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the heavy ink on his forearms. In the dim light, he looked less like a savior and more like a ghost, a beautiful, dangerous ghost. "Where am I?" she whispered. Her voice sounded thin, like dry parchment. "My home," Adrian said. He stood up, and the sheer scale of him made the massive room feel suddenly small. He walked toward the bed, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. He stopped a few feet away, respecting a boundary Sofia hadn't even set. "The estate is 20 miles outside the city. No one knows you're here. No one can reach you." Sofia looked around the room, the gold-leafed mirrors, the marble fireplace, the sheer, excessive luxury of it all. It was a fortress, but it was gilded. Why, she asked again, the same question Shed asked in the car. "You don't know me. I'm just a wrong number." Adrian looked at her, his blue eyes unreadable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass vial, set it on the nightstand, and slid it toward her. "Pain medication. The doctor says 3 of your ribs are cracked, not broken. You'll heal, but you need to stay still." He didn't answer her question. He didn't tell her that he had spent the night watching her sleep, because he couldn't shake the image of her hiding in a bathtub. He didn't tell her that he had deleted a man from existence just to make sure she never had to look over her shoulder again. "I want to go home," she said, though the words felt hollow the moment they left her mouth. She didn't have a home anymore. "You have no home to go to, Sofia," Adrian said, his voice dropping to that low, tectonic rumble. "The lease on your apartment was terminated this morning. Your belongings, the few that weren't ruined, are being moved into the dressing room behind you. Greg is gone. He won't be coming back." Sofia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The efficiency of it was terrifying. In the span of a few hours, this man had dismantled her entire life and rebuilt it inside his own walls. She was safe, yes, but she was also completely untethered. "You destroyed my life," she breathed. "I ended a nightmare," Adrian corrected. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over the bed. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he seemed to think better of it and dropped it to his side. "There is a bell on the nightstand. If you need anything, food, water, clothes, press it. My staff is at your disposal, but you are not to leave this wing without me. Am I a prisoner?" Adrian leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could see the faint scar near his eyebrow and the intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. A prisoner is someone who wants to leave. After a few days in this world, Sofia, you'll realize that the world outside is the real cage. Here, you're the only thing that matters. He turned and walked toward the door, his presence leaving a vacuum in the room. Just before he exited, he paused. "Breakfast will be sent up in 10 minutes. Eat. You look like a ghost." The heavy oak door clicked shut, and Sofia was alone again in the silence. She waited a few minutes before pushing back the covers and swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Her head spun, and her side throbbed, but she forced herself to stand. She walked toward the window and pulled back the heavy drapes. Below her lay acres of manicured gardens, surrounded by a stone wall topped with wrought iron spikes. In the distance, she could see 2 men in black suits walking the perimeter, their hands near their waistbands. This wasn't a house. It was a compound. She moved to the dressing room Adrian had mentioned. She pushed open the double doors and gasped. It was a room larger than her entire old apartment, filled with rows of shoes, silk dresses, and soft cashmere sweaters all in her size. On a velvet stool in the center of the room sat her dead phone, plugged into a charger. She picked it up. It flickered to life. There were no messages from Greg, no messages from her brother. It was as if she had stepped into a void. She sat on the floor of the dressing room, surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of clothes she hadn't asked for, and let out a shaky breath. She was safe. She was warm. She was fed. But as she looked at the high stone walls outside, she realized that Adrian Kozlov hadn't just saved her. He had claimed her. The fear of Greg was gone, replaced by a new, more complex fear. It was the fear of the man who could move mountains with a text message, the man who looked at her with a hunger that felt like a different kind of danger. She picked up a cashmere sweater, the fabric so soft it felt like a caress. She pulled it on, shivering as the warmth hit her. She didn't know who Adrian was or what he wanted from her, but as she looked at her reflection in the full-length mirror, pale, bruised but alive, she knew one thing for certain. The girl who had sent that text message was dead. The woman standing in this gilded fortress was someone else entirely, and she was beginning to realize that the most dangerous thing about Adrian Kozlov wasn't his power or his violence. It was the way he made her want to stay. The evening air in the estate was thick with the scent of pine and rain, cooling the vast rooms despite the warmth of the hidden heating vents. Sofia sat on the edge of the oversized bed, her fingers tracing the intricate embroidery of the silk duvet. The house was too quiet. Every time a floorboard creaked or the wind brushed against the reinforced glass, her shoulders hiked toward her ears. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the moment the luxury turned into another kind of nightmare. A rhythmic, heavy knock sounded at the door. Before she could answer, it opened and Adrian stepped inside. He had changed into a simple black sweater, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing the corded muscle of his forearms and the dark, overlapping ink of his tattoos. He wasn't carrying a weapon or a drink this time. He was carrying a silver medical tray. "Doctor left instructions for the dressing on your side," Adrian said. His voice was low, filling the corners of the room. "He's busy with a situation at the docks. I told him I would handle it." Sofia felt her pulse quicken, not with the sharp, jagged fear she had felt with Greg, but with a strange, heavy tension that made it hard to swallow. "You don't have to do that. I can do it myself." Adrian didn't respond. He simply walked over and pulled a heavy velvet ottoman toward the bed, sitting directly in front of her. The height difference was still staggering. Even sitting, he seemed to tower over her, his knees nearly touching hers. The proximity was overwhelming. He smelled of cedar and something clean like the air before a storm. "Lift your sweater, Sofia," he commanded. It wasn't a suggestion, but it wasn't a threat either. It was the tone of a man used to being obeyed without question. With trembling fingers, Sofia reached for the hem of the oversized cashmere sweater he had provided. She lifted it just high enough to reveal the thick white gauze taped to her ribs. The skin around the bandages was a sickening shade of yellow and deep mottled green. She looked away, her face flushing with a mix of shame and vulnerability. Adrian's hands were large, his fingers blunt and scarred at the knuckles, but as he reached out to peel away the medical tape, he was incredibly precise. He didn't rush. He moved with a focused, clinical grace. When the last of the tape gave way, Sofia hissed, her breath hitching as the cool air hit the inflamed skin. "Sorry," he murmured. It was the first time she had heard him apologize for anything, even if it was just for a sting of tape. He picked up an antiseptic wipe and began to clean the area. Sofia watched him. His head was bowed, his brow furrowed in concentration. From this distance, she could see the faint lines around his eyes and the way his jaw remained permanently set, as if he were constantly bracing for a blow. He looked like a man who had never known a day of peace, yet here he was, treating her wounds as if she were made of the finest porcelain. The silence between them stretched, thick and charged. Every time his cool fingers brushed against her skin, a spark of electricity shot through her, settling deep in her stomach. It was a confusing sensation. She should have been repulsed. She should have been terrified of a man who dealt in death. But as he worked, she found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn to the sheer, unshakable heat radiating from his body. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Adrian stopped. He didn't pull his hand away. His thumb rested just below the worst of the bruising, the warmth of his skin a stark contrast to the ache in her bones. He looked up, his gray eyes searching hers. For the first time, they didn't look like ice. They looked like smoke. "I told you," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You're mine to protect now. That includes the things I can't shoot." "Don't belong to anyone," she challenged weakly, though she knew it was a lie. In this house behind these walls, she belonged entirely to him. Adrian's gaze darkened. He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers. She could see the dark gold flecks in his iris and the way his pupils dilated. "In this city, Sofia, everyone belongs to someone. You spent 3 years belonging to a coward who broke you to feel big. Now, you belong to a man who will burn the world to keep you whole. Choose which one you prefer." He didn't wait for an answer. He reached for a fresh roll of gauze and began to wrap it around her waist. To do it properly, he had to slide his arm behind her back, pulling her inches away from his chest. Sofia rested her hands on his shoulders to steady herself. The muscle beneath the black fabric felt like polished stone. She could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his heart, and for a moment her own heartbeat synced with his. As he tucked the end of the bandage in, his hand lingered on her hip. The touch was possessive, a silent claim that made her blood run hot. He looked at her lips, then back at her eyes, the tension in the room reaching a breaking point. Sofia didn't pull away. She couldn't. She was caught in his orbit, a moth circling a very beautiful, very dangerous flame. Adrian let out a slow, jagged breath. He pulled back just an inch, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Eat the dinner they bring you tonight, all of it. I want you strong, Sofia." "Then what?" she asked. "And then we see if you're brave enough to be the queen of a monster," he said. He stood up abruptly, the silver tray clattering slightly as he picked it up. He didn't look back as he walked toward the door. He moved with the same predatory grace he always had, but there was a new stiffness in his shoulders, a sign that the intimacy of the moment had affected him just as much as it had her. When the door closed, Sofia sank back into the pillows, her skin still tingling where he had touched her. She looked at the fresh white bandage, perfectly applied. He was a man of violence, a man who had admitted he was a monster. But as she lay there in the silence of the gilded fortress, she realized she wasn't afraid of his hands anymore. She was afraid of the way her heart beat faster when he left the room. She had been saved from a man who wanted to kill her, only to be claimed by a man who wanted to own her. And the most terrifying part was that, for the first time in years, she didn't want to run. She wanted to know what it felt like to be loved by a monster. The piece of the estate was a fragile glass ornament, and it shattered 3 weeks after Sofia arrived. It happened during dinner, a meal that had become a silent, high-tension ritual between her and Adrian. The dining room was vast, lit by a crystal chandelier that cast long, sharp shadows against the oak-paneled walls. Adrian was midway through explaining the history of a painting on the far wall when his burner phone, the one he never used at the table, vibrated with a violent, rhythmic persistence. He didn't check the screen. He knew the vibration pattern. His expression didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to displace, turning cold and thin. "Victor," Adrian said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The doors opened instantly. Victor didn't speak. He simply held out a tablet. On the screen was a live feed of the estate's north gate. A black sedan had been left idling in the middle of the road, its trunk popped open. Inside was a mess of red roses and a single, severed finger wearing a signet ring from one of Adrian's captains. It was a message from the Volkov family, a declaration that they had seen the weakness. Adrian was hiding behind his stone walls. Adrian stood up, his chair scraping against the floor like a blade. He looked at Sofia. His eyes were no longer the smoky gray she had grown accustomed to during their quiet evenings. They were the color of a winter sea. "They think you are a liability," Adrian said, his voice devoid of heat. "They think because I brought a girl into my house, I've lost my edge." "Are they?" Sofia asked, her voice trembling as she stood up. The old, familiar fear was clawing at her throat, but it was different now. She wasn't afraid of the man in front of her. She was afraid of losing the safety he represented. People who mistake mercy for a flaw, Adrian replied. He turned to Victor. Status: Thayer hitting the perimeter sensors on the west side. It's a distraction. The real play is the service entrance. They want her, boss. They want to show the city what happens when you have a heart. Adrian reached into the small of his back and pulled out a sleek, matte black handgun. He checked the chamber with a metallic click that echoed in the silent room. He didn't look at Sofia as he spoke. Go with Victor. There is a reinforced room in the cellar. Do not come out until I open the door. No, Sofia said. The word was small, but it stopped Adrian in his tracks. He turned, his brow furrowed in genuine surprise. Sofia, this isn't a game. These men aren't Greg. They don't want to bruise you. They want to end you to prove a point to me. Sofia stepped around the long table, her heart hammering against her healing ribs. She looked at the man who had cleaned her wounds and carried her through the rain. She saw the tension in his jaw and the way his hand gripped the weapon. He was ready to die for her, but she realized that if she hid in the cellar, she would always be the wrong number. She would always be the victim he had to carry. If I hide, they said, her voice growing steadier. If they see me as your weakness, they will never stop coming. You said I had to be brave enough to be a queen. A queen doesn't hide in the basement while her king fights her battles. Adrian stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Victor shifted uncomfortably by the door, the radio on his shoulder crackling with urgent reports of breached fences. Finally, Adrian stepped toward her. He reached into his waistband and pulled out a second, smaller pistol, a compact 9. He held it out to her, handle first. Do you know how to use this? No, she whispered. Point, squeeze. Don't look away, he said, his eyes boring into hers. If they get past me, you are the last line of defense. Can you do that, Sofia, or am I wrong about you? She took the cold, heavy steel from his hand. It felt alien, a weight that promised a different kind of life. I'm not going back to the bathtub, Adrian. The sirens began to wail across the estate, a low, mournful howl. Adrian grabbed her hand, his grip possessive and fierce. He didn't take her to the cellar. He took her to the security hub, a room filled with monitors showing every inch of the grounds. Stay behind the desk, Adrian commanded. Watch the screens. Tell Victor if you see movement on the east terrace. I'm going to end this. For the next 20 minutes, Sofia watched a world she had only ever seen in movies. She watched Adrian move through the gardens like a ghost, a silhouette of absolute lethality. She saw the flashes of muzzle fire in the dark and heard the muffled cracks of suppressed shots. Her hands shook so hard the gun rattled against the mahogany desk, but she didn't look away. On the third monitor, she saw a shadow move. A man in a tactical vest was scaling the balcony of the library, the very room where she spent her afternoons reading. He was bypassing the main fight, heading straight for the heart of the house. She didn't call for Victor. There was no time. She stood up, the small pistol heavy in her grip, and ran toward the library. Her side ached, a sharp reminder of where she had come from, but she pushed through it. She reached the library just as the glass door shattered. The man stepped inside, the moonlight catching the serrated edge of a knife in his hand. He saw Sofia and laughed, a wet, arrogant sound. So this is the little bird, he sneered, stepping over the broken glass. Kozlov is going to be so disappointed when I send him your... Sofia didn't wait for him to finish. She remembered Adrian's words, point, squeeze, don't look away. The recoil of the gun was more violent than she expected, a jolt that traveled up her arms and into her teeth. The roar of the shot was deafening in the small room. The man didn't scream. He simply crumpled, the knife clattering to the floor. Sofia stood there, the gun still raised, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The smell of gunpowder was sharp and acrid, filling her lungs. She expected to feel a crushing weight of guilt, but all she felt was a strange, cold clarity. She had protected her space. She had protected the man who had saved her. The doors to the library burst open. Adrian charged in, his suit jacket torn, blood splattered across his white shirt. He stopped when he saw the body on the floor. He looked at the gun in Sofia's hand, then up at her face. He didn't say a word. He walked across the room, his boots crunching on the glass, and stopped in front of her. He gently took the gun from her trembling fingers and set it on a table. Then he cupped her face in his large, scarred hands. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "No," she whispered. "I did what you said." Adrian leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing for a brief second. The silence in the room was absolute, the battle outside finally fading into the night. "They won't call you a weakness again," Adrian murmured against her skin. "They saw a girl they could break. Now they'll see the woman who belongs to the devil." He pulled her into a fierce, crushing embrace. Sofia leaned into him, her fingers curling into his blood-stained shirt. She realized then that the price of protection wasn't just being saved. It was being willing to stand in the fire alongside the person who saved you. She wasn't just a wrong number anymore. She was a part of the darkness, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the shadows. She was the one who cast them. The morning after the attack on the estate, the air felt different. The smell of gunpowder had been replaced by the crisp, neutral scent of expensive cleaning supplies and the distant, briny breeze from the coast. Sofia stood on the balcony of the library, the very spot where she had stood her ground only hours before. The broken glass had been replaced by a silent crew that moved like shadows, leaving the room as pristine as if the violence had been a fever dream. She looked down at her hands. They were steady. Tremor that had defined her life for 3 years, the one that started in her marrow and ended in her fingertips, was gone. A heavy, familiar presence settled behind her. She didn't flinch, she didn't even turn around. She knew the weight of Adrian's shadow before he ever spoke. "Volkovs have gone quiet," Adrian said, his voice a low vibration in the morning air. "They lost 6 men last night. They lost the element of surprise. And they learned that the girl in my house isn't a target, she's a threat." Sofia turned to face him. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his gray eyes more pronounced in the unforgiving morning light. He had traded his blood-stained shirt for a clean black one, but he hadn't slept. He stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that used to make her want to bolt. Now it just made her feel seen. "I'm not going to the cellar next time," she said. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a statement of fact. Adrian walked toward her, stopping only when he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He reached out, his thumb tracing the fatting yellow bruise on her jaw. "There won't be a next time like that. Not here, but if there is, no, you won't be in the cellar." He looked out over the estate, his eyes scanning the perimeter where his men were doubling the patrols. "I spent my life building these walls to keep people out, Sofia. I thought the more I owned, the safer I was. But last night when I heard that shot in the library, I realized I hadn't built a fortress. Id built a cage, and I was terrified that Id trapped you inside it just in time for the world to burn it down." "I told you I wasn't a prisoner," Sofia whispered. "I know what I am," Adrian said, finally looking back at her. "I know that to the rest of this city, I am the man who makes the rules and breaks the people who don't follow them. I know that I took your old life away without asking. But I need you to understand something." He took her hand, his large, rough palm swallowing hers. He led her back into the library toward the large mahogany desk where the small pistol had sat only hours before. On the desk now sat a velvet box and a set of keys. "What is this?" she asked. "Keys are to a townhouse in Rittenhouse Square," Adrian said. "The deed is in your name. There is an account at the city's private bank. It's enough to ensure you never have to answer to anyone for the rest of your life. If you want to walk out of those gates today, the car is waiting. No one will follow you. No one will watch you. You'll be a ghost to me just like Greg is to the world." Sofia looked at the keys, then up at him. "You're letting me go." "I'm giving you the choice I took from you the night I kicked in your door," Adrian said. His voice was thick, a rare crack appearing in his armor of cold authority. "I realized last night that I can't protect you by owning you. I can only protect you by being the man you choose to stay with. If you stay, it's because you want to be the woman at my side, not the girl I saved." Sofia looked around the room, the leather-bound books, the heavy drapes, the man who looked like he was waiting for a death sentence. She thought about the bathtub. She thought about the shaking hands and the 1% battery. Then she thought about the weight of the gun in the library and the way Adrian had looked at her when he realized she was safe. She reached out, but she didn't touch the keys. She touched the collar of his shirt, pulling him down until their foreheads rested against each other. "The night I sent that text, I was running," she murmured. "I spent every day of my life running from shadows, from loud noises, from the man who was supposed to love me. I'm tired of running, Adrian." "Sofia." Don't want the townhouse, she said, her voice growing firm. I don't want a life where I am looking over my shoulder wondering if the Volkovs or someone like them is going to find me. I want to be where the shadows are afraid to go. She looked into his gray eyes, seeing the flicker of hope struggle against his natural cynicism. You aren't my prison, Adrian. You're the first person who ever gave me a reason to stop running. You didn't just save my life. You gave me a life where I get to decide who I am. Adrian's hands went to her waist, his grip tightening as if he were afraid she might vanish if he let go. You know what staying means. It means you're the most important person in this empire. It means my enemies will always see you first. Then let them look, Sofia said, because they'll have to look through you to get to me. And they'll have to look through me to get to you. Adrian let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks. He leaned down, his lips finally meeting hers in a kiss that was both a promise and a surrender. It wasn't the tentative, careful touch from the night he tended her wounds. It was the kiss of a man who had finally found the one thing in the world worth more than his crown. He pulled back, his hand lingering on the back of her neck. I told you once that you were my priority because I claimed you. I was wrong. You're my priority because without you none of this matters. The docks, the money, the power. It's just noise. You're the signal, Sofia. He picked up the velvet box from the desk and opened it. Inside wasn't a ring for her finger but a small, intricate pendant of a phoenix carved from black diamond. He fastened it around her neck, the cold stone resting against her skin. Girl who texted the wrong number is gone, Adrian said. Long live the queen. Sofia looked at her reflection in the glass of the library doors. She saw a woman who stood tall, a woman whose eyes were clear and whose heart was finally quiet. She reached up and touched the pendant, then turned back to the man who had become her world. Let's go to breakfast, Adrian, she said with a small, confident smile. We have a city to run. As they walked out of the library hand in hand, the staff bowed their heads in genuine respect. Sofia didn't look down. She didn't look back. She walked beside the most dangerous man in Philadelphia, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for the splintering of wood. She was the one who held the keys to the kingdom, and she had finally found the home she had been searching for in the heart of a monster.